Thank you. Thank you. Really happy to be here. And good morning, AMF. Show me some love. Good morning, AMF. Yeah, really happy to be here. So let's see if I have the magic with the clicker now. Lovely. So this is the question I want you asking. Who funds the news you see on your phone? And it's not as easy of a question as you might think. It's two questions in one. Who funds the news? I won't get into what is news nowadays. And then, how does it get onto your phone in the first place? And not just for us as newsmakers, but also really for the entire continent. And I want to challenge and hopefully reframe this question for us. I'd say if we look at it from the mainstream, so the news as we know it, right? The legacy media houses that are out there, we have those that are privately owned. You have entrepreneurs, investors, other people who have chosen media as their line of work, matching audiences with advertisers and serving some commercial end. We also have internationally owned ones. In the case of Kenya, with this visual that came out a few years ago, you have philanthropists globally who are also involved in mainstream media or media in general. And then you have, of course, state-owned or, state-owned or government broadcasters. You also have government publishers, and that can be across the board. But what this tells us is there's also some nuance where you have the question of where do they sit? And this depends on the media freedoms also in your respective country. Are they along some ideological lines? Are they along a line of how close they are in proximity to the government or not? And this is how it used to be. But right now, the challenge when you add the phrase on your phone is that we're seeing a new set of players that many of us might never have taken the time to get to know. The first of these for me is a popular website in Nigeria. Let's see if so some of you would have heard of Legit, which started off as Nige.com in 2012. And they were the first online news website to reach 1 million likes, if you will, on Facebook. Right? So started in 2012. And you can see here from the Reuters Institute Digital News Report that they are the #1 online news source, ranked a little higher than the BBC itself. All right, so you see their homepage, politics, some sports, and you also will see an interesting phrase we'll discuss called recommended for you. And that's something I want you to pay close attention to. The second website for us to take a look at is, if I go back one, there we go, is tuko.co.ke, right? So here you see again, Reuters Institute, their digital news report, #1 online news source in the country. And on top of that, what you see there is the homepage. You see various stories, politics, sports, culture, entertainment. You also see that phrase again, recommended for you. And then if we look to South Africa, you have Briefly, right, which is coming up. And Briefly is a rising website. It doesn't feature anywhere among the Reuters examples, but you're seeing a pattern here. And hopefully you're seeing a similar set of colors and different logos. That should tell you something about where we're going with this conversation now. And while it doesn't rank here, it's competitive. The Briefly website is, or Briefly News, and taking the same playbook you're seeing in other parts of the continent. And if you go to Ghana, you now have the #2 website, yen.com.gh, same thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's a bit of a pattern here, isn't there? Recommended for you, similar website, similar look and feel. And that's because the websites that we're seeing here, if you ask any man on the street in any of those 3 countries, they will say these are locally owned, locally led, locally run organizations, and that would be partly right. However, if you've never heard of this lovely organization, I want to introduce you to Legit Technologies, formerly Genesis Media in emerging markets. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is an amazing organization that has done some interesting entrepreneurial ventures based out of the Ukraine. And so each of the websites I've just shared are Ukrainian owned, invested, but they are locally led and operated. So they have entirely local news teams, and so they are locally run. They present a lot of local context, but this is an example of how in the last decade, you would have thought that our media is competing with local upstarts, local examples, local firms, but there's a global race to own and certainly to mediate how news gets on to Africans' homepages, their screens, and their browsers. And this could be any one of the other countries on the continent as well. And so what does the Legit group bring? In this case, a content management system, ad tech, an entire sales operation that works across each of the three nations. You also have growth and audience acquisition. They, and many media might frown upon this, they paid their way to their audience. They spent tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to acquire those same audiences. And now that they have them, they're monetizing them. And some people say, oh, I'd never promote my news. It must sell itself. Well, that's not how the internet works nowadays, ladies and gentlemen. And lastly, you have, beloved clicker, be nice, yes, the local first storytelling with international and regional best practices. So not many people know that this is some of the ways that our screens and the news is funded and leading to us nowadays. And if we switch gears, I think what we see when we examine the group is they have more than just these platforms. They have YouTube channels, they have various type of ventures that are trying to play into video, and they have a number of innovative practices they're doing that are worth reckoning with because of how quickly they're acquiring and growing audiences online. And they've built up over this decade over 50 million monthly active users, I think 17,000 articles published every month, and over 40 million social media users across their platforms. And so they aren't playing the game in the organic, old-fashioned, one story at a time. They're playing it at scale and playing to win. And the question for us is, how are we in the room aware of that, or more importantly, choosing to compete? Because in the end, in the attention economy, that's part of the competition that's out there, is finding ways to reach people. When the war in Ukraine started, they put together the first ever gathering of African media with President Zelensky, and that's where you have the soft power angle showing now, where they're saying that we will put together these voices, these people. We will come with a point of view for what has been going on over the last 3 years with the war happening in Ukraine. So that's an example, again, of how you have the international aspect now playing out, besides all the local publishing, where many locals might not pick out, oh no, who's behind this, who funds this? And most importantly, we look at now how it's gotten to many people. I want you to notice the words on the top of the screen. Their mobile app, they said, is faster than your browser. So what they've tried to do is make sure that the utility of their mobile app experience is built from the ground up from an African perspective. It would preload stories for you. So when you leave your place, you turn off your data, it is still serving you stories. So they are building for a use case here. And on top of that, you'll find that they made agreements for what are called pre-installed. So as millions of people buy millions of smartphones, those apps are coming pre-installed, Legit, Tuko, Briefly, Yen, for the respective markets, and with notifications on. My own grandmother, I was talking with my mom yesterday when I told her about this talk, and we are always fascinated how my grandmother knows things. And it's because a few years ago when cousins bought her a smartphone, this was one of the things that came with it. Notifications on and this website. And now she's there breaking news to us on the family WhatsApp group, right? And this is an example of where they're starting somewhere that says, you'll never have to download anything. Why don't we actually pre-install it for you, right? And if we look, I think, to the rest of the continent now, we find some unfamiliar or familiar countries and people all competing. Let me see if, there we go. So some of you will have heard of Opera, the Norwegian company, which a few years ago was sold to a Chinese conglomerate. And they are not afraid to say that they will literally put megabytes in people's phones just so they can start and use their platforms. Again, that doesn't sound familiar to us, but that is removing any obstacle in the attention economy, saying, why should you have to pay for it? And so what you find with them is that Opera has, at least back in 2020, had over 200 million monthly active users for Opera News, leave alone the browser. And when we say that, just for context, In the same year, the total number of Facebook users in Africa was 232 million. So they were on a stratospheric tear of a very small app. And the word I want you to think about now is algorithm. Because it's not just who funds the news. The way it gets to your phone is no longer you visiting websites. It's platforms like Opera News that decide what you see, that choose where each one of us is getting personalized stories. I get more sports, you get more gossip. She gets more entertainment, he gets more of international news. And all of that's being done to where we can all sit in the same city, but it's not like the newspaper where we get served the same information. We're each getting it tailored, and it's many different players. In this case, formerly Norway, currently China, and you can see their play that across the continent, they were giving people megabytes, making it almost impossible not to participate. And who would fund that? In Kenya, the reason they stopped making these free offers is because they weren't allowed to charge sports betting companies for a certain very lucrative digital real estate, so something for us to think about. And as we bring this to a close, I think a couple other players that we might be thinking of. Some of you may never have heard of Scooper News, but Scooper is part of Transsion Group. So when 2 out of every 5 smartphones are sold on the continent, a large majority of them are either Tecno, Infinix, Spice, or itel. Those are the phone brands that hundreds of millions of Africans know. And that company isn't just selling hardware, they sell software now. So they have the biggest music streaming app, bigger than Apple Music, bigger than Spotify, bigger than SoundCloud, and it's called Boomplay. And they're not just following that. They have a news app called Scooper. And Scooper even partnered with the electoral body here in the 2022 general elections. And so you see what they were doing here, saying, we have the official source of news and have even partnered with the electoral body. And those are some of the algorithms, again, that are setting the agenda every single day for hundreds of millions of Africans. And in this case, again, coming out of China, coming pre-installed. This is Phoenix browser. And some of us may not have heard or really used it. But in this case, I'm fascinated by this one. Again, out of China, it has its own set of algorithms. It even has a TikTok clone inside it. And I'm always shocked at the ways I can travel to very rural parts of Kenya or Africa and people uploading content in there. So it's a browser that helps you download, because I won't get into the piracy conversation, but just know downloading is one of the most important things people do, because they don't want to stream, they don't want to pay with their megabytes twice. And it has features to do that. It can even save people's statuses. Now, why does this matter to us? Because these features are built for African audiences, and these algorithms are built to serve a very personalized experience. And we might not be seeing it because we're focused on publishing the news, not how it gets to people. We did an experiment at Nendo, my firm, a few years ago, and part of what we asked was how many megabytes are the story and how much is what we call ad tech. And from what we could tell, in some cases, again, this is years ago, so times have changed, but up to 70% of it was ad tech in some cases. And the idea with this was that people are going to different browsers like Opera Mini saying, I need you to eliminate ads, and I need you to shrink the internet for me. And that's part of what we've seen and noticed. And more brands like Phoenix, like Scooper, like Opera News are pursuing Africans with that promise. We will eliminate ad tech, but we'll also give you an algorithm that sets the table for you and the agenda. Even African Stream that we've seen some time back, when we ask who's funding this news, we see players like them who've built up hundreds of millions of views, but as it would turn out, allegedly, from this letter from Secretary Blinken, are a front for Russia Today, allegedly, and presenting Kremlin propaganda, weaponizing, allegedly, Pan-Africanism and a number of ideas with a hidden hand. And many Africans online were skeptical, asking, where are you getting your funding, etc. And when this came out, they were sanctioned, meaning they lost their Gmail, Google Drive, YouTube, social media platforms. But it raises the question of who's funding that news, right? Who pays for the news that gets to me and gets onto these algorithms to reach me and potentially millions or hundreds of millions of other Africans? And it's hard enough to keep media funded. So when we ask the question, and as I end, this question has so many layers to it. And the players that we see playing now are not your usual suspects. It's been the US and the UK, Germany and others. But when we look today, we see CGTN out of China who've been here longer than a decade. We see TRT, for example, who in our view have come in with a very similar playbook around reflecting on African history and the more unflattering parts for Western or formerly colonial legacies on the continent. And all of them are racing. But the unseen hand in all of this is the three organizations I shared. Ooh, sorry. These three organizations I shared, like Scooper, Opera Mini, and others. And it's time we ask the question, not just of the news we make, but how it gets to the audiences. Thank you very much.